Hello, today I'm going to be videotaping how to do an injector service or injector removal on a 1993 Toyota T100. This is a 3.0 liter Toyota V6 I'll be working on today. First, you want to remove your battery cable from your negative battery terminal. Next, you want to remove the air baffling. You want to loosen both fittings. And you want to take your PCV clamp hose off, as well as down below you can see your resonator box that has a clip, and you take that off and you can remove your air baffle. Now what I'm going to do is line all of the parts up in the bed of this truck. Next, I'm going to remove the vacuum fittings that go to the air box, as well as any vacuum fittings that directly connect to this part of the engine. Whenever I move the intake plenum from the intake manifold, I'm only going to lift it up and back. I'm going to leave all of these nasty vacuum connections alone, so that way I don't have to figure out where to route them later. If you decide that you want to completely remove the intake plenum, then this is a snapshot of all of the vacuum routing, which I believe is correct for the back of the engine. I also went ahead and removed the first cable. This is the cable for the cruise control. Be sure that when you're doing this you only loosen one nut so as not to throw off the place where it mounts onto this bracket. You don't want it to be too far out of adjustment, or else your cruise control won't work right. You want to do the same thing for your throttle cable. You want to do that and then push that little lead through this way and pull it out. Next, I'm going to remove the throttle body. To do this, there are going to be 2 bolts and 2 nuts, I believe. There's a bolt up top here and a bolt up top here, as well as 2 down below, which are more difficult to get to, which is why I'm using a 6-inch extension for my 3/8 drive 12mm. Here's a view from the front of the engine. I don't know if you can see this. Right here's a bolt. Right back here is a bolt. This is a bolt, and this is the last bolt. And these are the only 4 bolts that hold the throttle body here, which you can see is loose, onto the intake plenum. I want to use a 12mm socket on an extension in order to get those off. Once you have the throttle body disconnected and are able to move it up and down, there's going to be a couple lines attaching it. Back here you're going to want to undo this clip, you're also going to want to undo this clip and pull these lines off, and then you can remove your throttle body. So I lied actually, you're going to want to take this clip off of the bottom underneath here. It's kind of hard to get to. And also you're going to want to disconnect this electrical connector right here, so that way you can lift this throttle body up and out of the way. Whenever you disconnect the coolant lines, you want to be prepared for a coolant to drip down in there, as you can see a little bit spilled out. And you want to make sure that you take the hoses that you've just disconnected and you want to prop them up kind of out of the way as such, like that. And then you want to disconnect any vacuum lines like this. Because these have memory, it's pretty simple to remember where they go on this engine, especially since I've done this before. But you may want to take tape and tape the vacuum lines to say, okay, this is number 1, goes to number 1 hose on your throttle body, or number 3 goes to number 3 metal line on your plenum. You'll also want to disconnect any electricals on this front side. Now again, I'm not going to be taking this plenum the entire way out because I don't want to mess with all of these lines back here, so I'm just going to fold this plenum over. So all that's going to involve is taking these bolts out. If my memory serves me correctly, you're going to need to undo this bolt, these 2 bolts, all of these bolts along here, a nut, and 2 more nuts. Right there, if you can see that. And this nut as well. And then your plenum should be able to lift up. There may be another one in the back here. In addition, you're going to want to take this vacuum diaphragm off. There will be a line, as you can see, I taped these off the last time I had this part. There'll be an attachment down below, and then this attachment up above. You want to take that off.
The last owner of this truck, or whoever worked on it anyways, I don't know if you can tell, but they gummed the hell out of this EGR pipe that goes into the exhaust manifold, or the intake manifold. So what I did was I got an adjustable wrench, and I got this nut loose, and as you can see, the intake manifold now moves, and we are able to lift it up.
Now that you've got this intake manifold lifted up and out of the way, now what you want to do is grab a shop rag and your 17mm wrench, and you want to go over to one of these Banjo fittings on the side of the fuel rail. Doesn't matter which side, because it's common fuel rail, and you want to crack one of these nuts loose. Now you want to have a rag prepared to go over this, because this may spray fuel everywhere. Depending on when the last time you drove it was, fuel pressure could leak down, or depending on how good your fuel pressure is, this may very well spray out at you at 30 psi. Now it's not a diesel engine where it's enough to hurt you, but it is enough to get in your eyes, and that can cause damage. So just be prepared. So once you've taken the intake manifold off and you've cracked your nuts loose that hold your Banjo fittings onto your common rail fuel injector, you're going to want to loosen 4 nuts. They're 12mm and they go on stud here, on a stud here, on a stud here, and I've left one in the back here. These could be fairly tight when you crack them, and you're going to want to have an extension and a 12mm socket. Once you've gotten the 4 nuts loose, you should be able to get a little bit of play in both of these fuel rails. However, they're not going to want to come up about more than that much on the thread. As you can see, I got play in this one. So what you're going to want to do is disconnect this Banjo fitting in the back and loosen up all the Banjo fittings all around in order to just give you a little bit more ability to move stuff around, give you a little slack in these hard metal lines. Now with the fuel rails up and out of the way and the vacuum lines in the back as well, you're now able to access this large nut in the back, and you're going to want to use an adjustable crescent wrench in order to crack that loose and remove that. Once you have your Banjo fittings cracked loose on the side of your fuel injector, both the front and the back ones, I also cracked this one loose and I cracked this one loose. You're going to want to take a 12mm 6-point or 12-point socket and get this nut off of this stud and this stud here, and then underneath of this nut will be a hard rubber insulator, and you're going to want to keep all of those with the nuts. After that, your fuel rail should start to have some play in it, and once you get these taken out, you should be able to remove your fuel rail. These Banjo bolts are a bit of a pain in the neck to get out, so you'll have to loosen them both a little bit at a time. At least that's what I had to do on the back ones. The front one came out pretty easy. And then also, on the front of these, there's a little washer here, and you want to keep that as well. Otherwise it'll fall down into your engine, you won't find it again. So be sure to take that little washer out, it fell down in there, and keep it with your Banjo bolt. Once everything's loose, you should be able to take your fuel rail and it should just pull right off. There may be a little resistance from the O-rings and the fuel injectors, but otherwise it should pull off fairly easily. You can just take this guy and kind of set it off to the side. I'm going to disconnect this connector from the back of the injector, so that way I can get better access to all of this. This is my problem injector. We're going to be replacing the O-ring on that. I don't know if you can see, that one's pretty boogered up. Especially right there, there's nothing left to it. No wonder it was leaking fuel really bad. So we'll be replacing this gasket, and we'll be replacing this top O-ring. So this is a little kit I bought for the injector. As you can see right here, this part in the middle goes right here. This O-ring goes in this top groove, and this guy goes actually down in the injector cup, where the injector pintle sits in this hard rubber cup. That should be the part number, in case you need to do that. Buy another injector seal kit. This is a comparison of the old O-ring right here to the new O-ring. As you can see, this one is in much better condition. It didn't break, and this one just disintegrated when I took it out. Also, on the tip of this fuel injector, you can see that there's an O-ring right here, and this fits down into this injector cup.
And if you have another one, you might as well replace it while you're in there.
Whenever you're ready to put this fuel rail back onto the engine, you want to make sure that everything's, reconnected nicely underneath here. All the fuel injectors are in their holes. And you never want to force anything. So you want to line up your stud on the front and your stud on the back and get everything nicely lined up. And then sort of wiggle it until everything goes together. You may have to use a rubber hammer. Now it may take a slight bit of wiggling back and forth and tapping as well with your fist on it. Don't hit it too hard because these parts are all aluminum and they will bend and break easily. So it should go together pretty simply here. And shouldn't be much play in it once you get it down. You know it's down because there's no gap between this rubber gasket and your fuel rail. Also be very careful. I don't know if you can tell on this side, it broke right here because it's a cast piece. This nut is super tight on the back. So again, don't go hitting on stuff because it will break and then you will be back to square one. Then, once you have the nuts reattached on here, and don't do them all the way up because you want a little bit of slack in this, you'll want to make sure that these Banjo nuts go in and you do not want to cross thread them. I don't know if you can tell, but it's slightly off to the side. If I were to try and just jam that in there right now, it would cross thread. So you need to make sure you lift everything up and get it in there all nice. Don't force anything again. This is what everything should look like when it's assembled again. What I did was I loosened up this Banjo bolt, I loosened this one up, and I loosened this one, and this one back here, as well as I left this nut and this nut off so I could move this fuel rail around. And that gave me enough so that way I could get these bolts back in and not have issues cross-threading. It's pretty simple to get it back in, again, just don't force it. Once you're ready to put your intake manifold back on, there's 4 of these extra long bolts, 2 bolts on the front of the intake, and then 2 nuts on the studs, one here and one right back under here. And you want to tighten them down snug. Don't go overboard. This is an aluminum engine and manifold and top end anyways, so it's easy to strip these threads out. With the 8 12mm fasteners secured in the front of the engine, you should be able to spin the EGR pipe nut back on. Now, last time I disconnected the 2 nuts that hold it to the exhaust manifold and just pulled it off that way, but this time I found it was just easier to disconnect this large nut with an adjustable crescent wrench and pop that on and off. It wasn't rusted shut. We don't really have rust problems here in Montana. It may vary by state. Next, you're going to want to begin by reattaching your vacuum lines to your fuel pressure regulator. You're also going to want to reattach this hose connector back. You'll want to reconnect your engine ground up top and your idle air control sensor, throttle position sensor, to your throttle body once you get that back on. Next, you want to put your throttle body back onto the intake plenum, and there's going to be 2 shorter bolts and 2 longer bolts that go back in, both at 12mm. Before you reconnect everything here, you're going to want to reconnect your coolant line to the throttle body down below. It's a lot harder to access with all the bolts attached, so you want to do that before you put everything back together. Now that your intake manifold is back on, you're going to want to reconnect your throttle cable, which has the 2 clips there. You're going to want to reconnect these using 2 12mm wrenches back into the slot on the throttle. And then you're also going to want to reconnect your cruise control if you have it, and this is for a automatic transmission kickdown cable if your truck has an automatic transmission, which this one does not. You also want to go ahead and reconnect your vacuum lines up top here. They have memories, so it'll be pretty obvious as to where they go. Now that all that's connected, you'll want to reconnect these 2 lines that go to your airbox. This one doesn't have its original clip. You want to put the clip back on for your fuel pressure regulator, and there should be a line that goes out of this top, but it fell off, so I gotta find that and put that back on.